My name's Matthew Schaefer. I'm from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I'm currently a psychology major, and I'm getting close to graduation. I'm going to be finishing here this next spring term. And in terms of mental illness and how it's kind of affected me, I do not personally struggle with mental illnesses. I do have ADHD, but to like a small extent. But more of my experience with mental illness has been more so with my wife, actually. I got married this past July, and my wife, she struggles with, it's like a lot of different symptoms of different mental illnesses, and she's kind of in the middle of one, either like having a diagnosis or like the diagnosis being correct per se. So she's like, she did have like major depressive disorder, which became generalized anxiety disorder, which is now possibly bipolar, but she's still going through that whole process. And at the time I was dating her, I was aware of these things, but not to an intimate level as specific as when, like, I've been married to her, I'm with her all the time, and so I'm exposed to a lot of the struggles that she has. In looking at my experience interacting with her, it's really interesting to see the wide perspective there is on mental illness, because since I'm kind of like partnered with her, it's like her family, her friends are now my family and my friends, and so I see how they interact and how they understand mental illness. And it's almost, I wouldn't say black and white, but it's really interesting to see people who really understand it and like sympathize with it versus people who don't really understand it. And that's something that is definitely significant to her in her life and how she's impacted, because the people that she surrounds herself with, since it's like very different between those two people, it does it affects her mental disorder. It just makes her more depressed or more anxious to meet people. For her, a lot of her family members, while they do know that she has a mental disability, mental illness, they don't necessarily treat it as such. A common misconception or idea that seems to be prevalent is kind of like I'm not sure the phrase I could put to it, but it's like, for them, it's like, yes, you have a mental illness, but it's like you still have like a will that's, like a willpower type of thing. And so what it's been interesting to see is a lot of people I've come to find expect that your mental illness doesn't affect your willpower type of thing. It's like, so for her, it's like, okay, so let's say on a normal day, it's probably a good day if she gets up at noon or 1, because she just can't physically get up because of just being exhausted and fatigued and very depressed. And it's like a matter of this past Christmas, we did family outings and things like that, but she couldn't participate. And the family members wouldn't say anything, around her, but when maybe when I'm with them or they're away, it's kind of why can't she just suck it up type of mentality. It's not necessarily they are angry or upset with her, but it's still this it's hard to separate sometimes. They have this mental illness versus they're just not trying hard enough type of thing. And I feel like that has been such a interesting experience for me to learn, because it's not a matter of trying hard enough, because it's mental illness does affect that. And so her, she is trying, even though it's not visible to anyone. It's just something completely mental. And I guess for her, in the way she's been impacted by mental illness, which I think is, I wouldn't say it's unique to her, but it's, I think, an experience a lot of people go through when doing school. She started at BYU. She had almost a 4.0 for about a year and a half, and she had a full tuition scholarship to BYU until this mental illness started it kind of progressively got worse I kind of started dating her a little bit after that kind of downward slope where it's like, where she obviously has this ability to do successful things, like go to class, do well on tests and maintain that academic ability. In my experience, it's difficult to live with someone and be married to someone who has mental illness, not because it annoys me or bothers me that she has these issues, but it's like I have to continue to do what I do, but then there's this other part of me that joins into my schedule where it's like I need to be there for her. I need to help set up stuff with her, and it's very draining, which I've come to find. It's like not having a mental illness, but then being kind of married to someone who struggles with it. It's like really hard for me to make sure I'm not adopting some of the symptoms, where it's like I need to avoid depression and things like that, because those it comes off of them onto you a little bit because you're so close and you want to help them. But sometimes with mental illness, there is that hopelessness that kind of comes, and sometimes that kind of comes into my perspective sometimes, where it's like there really doesn't seem to be a way out or a way to help, or I feel kind of in a position of where I'm incapable of doing anything, and that's very hard to deal with. But what I've come to know is like with working with her, it's like it is a matter of like I need to know how she's doing, and like mentally and physically. Like it's really easy to see someone who's like sick and be like, oh my gosh, let me give you some ibuprofen, like I've got these medications, let me help you, kind of help you get better. It's very different with mental illness, because it's like it's a very different, I guess, ballgame of help, where you have to be kind of like mentally 100% there. So you're just there to listen, you're there to understand where they're coming from, listening to them kind of vent their the things that they're going through, the depression, kind of like what's making her depressed or what's making her anxious. For me, well, like I mentioned earlier with ADHD, I get really distracted, and so that's also like a problem there. But that's something that I'm learning more and more, is just like having to kind of separate myself from what I'm doing so I can be there for her when she needs me to be. So.
What a story. It's amazing. I have a question.
Yeah.
It's okay. You're in such a unique experience, and the way you take it is amazing. Your perspective is mind-blowing. How would you help someone else in this situation too, that's either married to someone or has a family member that, like, as an outside perspective, trying to help someone with mental illness? How would you advise them to help someone?
I think also kind of going off Annie Kate's question is, what have you done to make sure that even though you're involved with someone, you're still not, like you said, taking on their problems? Because that's really hard when you're with someone who you're married to, or your family with, or you're super close, is you're trying to help them, you're trying to reach out to them. But what have you done to also make sure that you're safe? Does that make sense? What have you done to reach out to other people to help yourself?
For me, I am very much like it's interesting just because I'm more of an extrovert and she's more of an introvert. For me, it's really helpful to get with other people. For me, I guess some of the things that I do is I love music. I love board games and activities, and I love sports. So for me, it's like I have to make sure that I'm doing things that make me happy, because it's very easy to be like, I can go hang out with my friends today and maybe go play some basketball tomorrow and do something the next day. But like the more things that that I put in for myself is taking away time from her. So it's like this balance of like, I need to make sure that I take time for myself, because if I'm 100% like there for her all the time, that's kind of where it starts. Like you're getting too mentally involved. I'm not sure how to phrase that. Yeah, it's just draining. And so it's like you have to recognize what kind of things give you that energy. And that's been really helpful for me, is just making sure that I do set aside time to do that. Because sometimes you get in this like, okay, like I'm married to you, I'm going to help you always. Like I'm there all the time. But it's something that we, come to agree on. So it's like something where it's like, she's like, you know, it's like, you need to go do something. Like, I'm okay with that, you know? Or it's like, she'll help me plan an activity like in the future. I think one thing that's been helpful is in the planning thing. For me, it's kind of like, with someone who has anxiety, planning is a very significant thing. So it's like, if things are planned ahead, it's okay, but spontaneous things are bad, like 100% of the time. And so it's like, she has like an expectation that like Wednesday night or something like that is like, that's when I'm there for her, and I don't plan anything there. But like, in terms of other things, as long as I'm like, hey, you know, Friday night, I want to go do this with so-and-so. As long as she knows kind of what I'm doing, it makes her less anxious and more okay with me doing those things that help me mentally. So.
Great. I learned from that, so thanks.
I know it's such good insight, just with helping anyone in general. Just, it's amazing you have that perspective.
Thanks.
And then lastly, what advice would you give to people who are kind of facing similar struggles as yourself?
I think, well, with the hope thing, it's like you can't really give up on hope, even though like things like depression and things like are very surrounding like the hopelessness part. And so I think the biggest thing that I would say is reaching out to other people. For example, for me, I've like living with mental illness, I've come to realize how many other people live with mental illness. And so it's like, I know other couples, or like my best friend, who's actually my cousin, who lives in our ward, he and his wife live across the street, and he deals with similar things to my wife. And so it's like, I've been able to have his wife and him to like help, like, I guess, communally understand what's going on, and then be able to kind of have that network of safety, in a sense, with other people. So it's like, if it's something that, if it's a matter of that, it's like, reach out to other people, get to know people who have the similar issues, and talk to them about it, because that makes you feel a lot better that you're not alone, because that's something that you will feel. And then another thing would be, like we mentioned before, just taking time for yourself to not fall into that similar boat. And then also, it would be, I guess, planning. I mentioned that before. I had something, but now I forgot. But in order to best help someone with a mental illness is to not have any any assumptions whatsoever, and to be very careful in jokes about mental illness as well, or to draw attention to things that they struggle with. For example, it's not helpful to point out to someone who struggles with mental illness that they're, I wouldn't say like doing something wrong, or like, I wouldn't say it like that, but like that it's like, hey, if you're feeling this way, this means we can't do this, or we can't do that, because they already know that, and it just makes them feel even worse to point those things out to them directly. So
That is